for inviting me. I hope you can hear me and the audio is clear. And thanks to you and Vikram for inviting me. This was an opportunity for me to kind of try and collect my thoughts around some of these questions. So I think this talk, in my mind at least, is already a success in some sense because I've kind of been able to formulate some thoughts around these questions. Okay, so let me just share my screen so that everyone can see. Okay, so the topic of this kind of talk is on India's local rural governance setup, and in particular Panchayati Raj. I call it 2 million democracies because in some sense, if you look at all the panchayats and the wards in across villages in India, there are actually 2 million elections that happen across all states, right? So each of these settings is an experiment in a democracy and therefore kind of will teach us something about how to improve the lives and livelihoods of people living in rural India. And so, without saying more on this, let me kind of move to the overview slide. Essentially, the way I kind of structured this talk is that I'll start with the fork in the road. Basically, I'll spend some time telling you about two contested visions of village life and what village life should look like and what village governance should look like. And then I will spend about 5 minutes kind of detailing what happened to village governance between independence in 1947 and then all the way up to 1992. The 1992 year is significant because it was the year in which the Panchayati Raj Act was passed, Amendment Act was passed, and I'll talk about why that was a significant year, why that act was really big, and why it was somewhat radical, even if it was somewhat of a halfway house between being fully empowered village governance and kind of top-down government models. And then finally, I'll talk about the impact since. And so when I talk about the road since, what I'm going to spend time talking about is elite capture, what's happened to elite capture. I'll define what the term means, what's happened to deliberation and gram sabhas at the panchayat level. And then I'll also talk about decentralization and the effects of devolving funds, functions, and functionaries to Panchayati Raj officials. I will, at the outset, kind of say a few things. One is that, especially the road since the last 30 years, kind of taking stock of what has happened with panchayats, I'm going to kind of, instead of doing a vast summary of all the kind of scholarship and writing available on this, I'm going to focus on a few key papers that that we can draw from the development economics literature. So it's going to be a very specific literature. And I know that there are many gaps in that literature, and that fault is entirely mine. I'm trained as a development economist, and I think this group is filled with development economists. So I thought it's just easier for us to focus on a few papers from there. I hope the lessons are still broad and you will learn from some of these papers, even if you don't pursue economics as a discipline. And then finally, I'll also say that, these papers are just a snapshot, and I'll try and draw some larger lessons from these on where village governance stands as of today. Okay, we cannot think of a view of village governance in India without thinking of the thinker, ideologue who most stridently spoke about village governance almost through his entire life, at least through the last 50 years of his life. In many ways, Mahatma Gandhi or Gandhiji brought India to the village. When I say that, what I mean is that the idea of India from, say, the 1880s onwards existed in some sense or the other amongst the Indian population, but it was largely an urban elite-centric idea of India that was in the drawing rooms of, the elite Congress members, Indian National Congress Party members who lived in these urban enclaves and who came from typically elite occupations. The person who, in some sense, was fundamental in taking that idea of India, secular, democratic, equal idea of India from the elite drawing rooms to the villages is Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi himself, amazingly, also envisaged an idea of independent India that came from the village. So Gandhi first took the idea of India to the village and then thought of India as an independent country that emerged from the village. In some sense, there were two large, broad reasons that he thought of village life as being fundamental to his idea of independent India. First, he thought of village India as being in opposition to Western civilization. Right. So this is a very telling quote. He said, "Cast off the cloak of foreign thoughts and ideas. Identify yourself with the villagers." This was a call that he gave to a lot of Indians in his writings. And he borrowed a lot from the thinker Henry Maine, who was basically a British government bureaucrat who spent a lot of time studying village governments in the 1880s in India. And Henry Maine, and therefore subsequently Gandhi, saw village life as the ideal opposition to the centralized Western state. So he, in some sense, saw, the fact that each of these villages functioned kind of independently. They had their own caste panchayats and they had their own ways of kind of deliberation and debate through what was called the Gram Sabha or the Gav Samaj. And he saw that as being central to presenting an alternate idea of an Indian civilization, which Gandhi kind of borrowed. In fact, Gandhi's famous quote is somebody asked him, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said something like, "It could be a good idea." And that was the kind of disdain that someone like Gandhi held for Western civilization and urban life more broadly. The Gandhian view of Indian democracy, therefore, kind of was rooted in the village. In fact, he often proclaimed that India lives in its 700,000 or 7 lakh villages. He saw village India, independent India, as having a set of villages that were kind of loosely strung together in the form of a set of beads. Each of these villages, in his view, were independent. They were self-sufficient. They provided everything that people in the village needed. They only depended on other villages for things that were not vital. So, for example, if you were married into a different village, you had to still build a road to go to the other village. So, therefore, for all those purposes, Gandhi kind of saw villages being somewhat interdependent. But for all vital purposes like food, clothing, shelter, Gandhi envisaged villages as being entirely self-sufficient. He also thought of villages as being non-hierarchical. For the most bit, every village kind of functioned by itself, and there was no real dependence on a structure, a pyramidal structure where there were higher village organizations or an organization that was a cluster of villages. For the most bit, he kind of saw villages functioning by themselves. He also envisioned an India, even though he was aware of the problems of village society, his ideal village India was an India that had perfect democracy. What does this mean? It meant equality across caste and religions, and it was entirely participatory in the sense that village India kind of came together in their villages to kind of talk to each other and talk to their elected leaders about what they needed in the form of these Gram Sabhas. So it was participatory in the sense that decision making was not delegated to someone outside. Decision making was actually arrived by consensus by members of the village coming together and kind of trying to build their sense of a more prosperous, a more caring, a more equal village society. And India, therefore, would be some combination of all these villages put together. That was the Gandhian idea. It was very, in some sense, utopian. And it was somewhat impractical given the conditions of the country at that point. And somebody who kind of staunchly and strongly opposed this view of village India was Dr. B. R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar, of course, is a great maker of modern India and spent a lot of time tirelessly exposing the contradictions and feudal underpinnings of Indian society. Ambedkar was a liberal thinker who in many sense, kind of drawing from his PhD advisor Dewey and several other scholars kind of always thought of the individual and individual rights as something that's central and that in some sense superseded community rights. And he very quickly identified the issues of village India as being rooted in the issues of caste. Ambedkar himself, of course, was a Dalit scholar, somebody who spent a lot of time amongst the marginalized members of society because he himself was one. He faced a lot of discrimination, and therefore he kind of understood fundamentally the problems with this conceptualization of villages as ideal democratic spaces, because villages also were places where caste was in many ways more central. And so therefore, Ambedkar had these very obvious real grievances. And what was remarkable about Ambedkar was, despite coming from such strong marginalized positions, he was also a realist. He kind of did not suffer any illusions about the village life, but he also understood that this was a way of being in India, and therefore the way to fix it was not to reject it entirely, but to try and impose a superstructure on this village life that would kind of slowly rectify and redeem this kind of life. So that's the two opposing strands. You have the Gandhian strand, which was much more egalitarian, which saw the village as being the central idea of independent India. And then you had Ambedkar, who very famously kind of said, what is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism? Somebody who had seen village India from the perspective of those oppressed by village India. And therefore, Ambedkar's vision for Indian democracy was very different. He thought of a constitutional liberal democracy that really saw no special role for village life. If anything, what Ambedkar kind of tried to argue was twofold. First, he said that, you could think of these Gram Sabhas or Gaon Samajas as being ideal participatory spaces, but how can you have participation that is in any way equal when there is no social and economic equality amongst different groups of people in village India? So that was one of the things that he said. So what he said was, the only way that you can make Indian life, not just village life, but more broadly Indian life, more equal is to have special provisions right up from the constitution onwards for members of disadvantaged groups. So what he called the depressed classes, or what we call Dalits and scheduled tribes today. And interestingly, Ambedkar kind of argued for reservations, not just in elected positions, but also in government jobs, but did not see reservations as being the end-all solution of all of India's depressed classes problems. He saw a much more larger program of slow weeding out of the poison of caste through constitutional democracy in India. So this is the opposing view in many ways to the Gandhian vision. And it was rooted in the understanding that caste is so central to village India that nothing that puts village India at the top of the idea of India will be equal. And that's where the perspective kind of comes from. So what happened then? What happened between these two contesting visions? Well, in 1947, we became an independent country. And in many ways, village India or Panchayati Raj got what I call the consolation prize, in the sense that the Ambedkarite view trumped the Gandhian view. The constitution did not make any special provisions or did not mandate any special provisions for Panchayat governments. And so instead, Panchayati Raj as a concept was moved entirely to the directive principles. The directive principles, for those who don't or can't remember their civics textbook from high school, the directive principles are basically a bunch of guidelines that the constitution has that it hopes that the people of India can kind of try and agree upon and follow, but there is no real constitutional mandate to follow these principles. The other big person in this entire story is, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. He himself was a visionary, a great leader, and he envisaged a much more centralized state with large infrastructure. In fact, this is an image of Nehru looking at, I think, the Bakranangal Dam, and he called dams, he called big mining projects as the temples of democracy. And in that large macro view vision of India, there was no real space for local governments. Right. So state governments were so what Nehru basically did was he said, we'll follow the constitution. We don't really have to establish these village governments. In fact, there's a letter that Nehru writes to Gandhi, I think in 1945, where he says that, I think your idea of village India is completely impractical and utopian. And, we shouldn't go in that direction with independent India. And sure enough, the way that independent India progressed was that state governments were given the right to establish their own panchayats if they so willed, but the central government would not kind of bring out a central law. Okay. So between 47 and therefore 92, how did village panchayats function and how did they look like? Of course, I can't survey the entire literature, but let me give you a snapshot from this scholar Ralph Retzlaff's book from the early 1960s. Retzlaff kind of studied one village in northern India, which he calls Khalapur. That's not the actual name. It's very close to Deoband, about 100 miles from Delhi. That's all he tells us. And his understanding of village life is the following. He said, just like Ambedkar felt, caste is very central to village life. In the village of Khalapur that he studies, the dominant Rajput castes were the castes that were responsible for kind of ensuring that village life progressed smoothly. They had all the power. They had their own kind of feudal relationships with everyone. They were the main landowners. At least one group of Rajputs in particular were the main landowners. And they had these kind of reciprocal relationships with many landless laborers and other castes who kind of worked on their lands or who worked for them. So you could imagine a Dalit household working in a Rajput land, and then the Rajput landlord kind of paying them some minimum wage in order to continue working for them. And so that was the kind of relationship. There was no real equal bargaining, as you could imagine, in a world of perfect competition and equal individuals. The relationships were very feudal, and there were what he calls caste-wise panchayats that had existed for a long time. What does this mean? I'm going to spend maybe 30 seconds on this. In Khalapur, every single every single caste had its own panchayat, in the sense that if I was a Rajput, I had my own Rajput panchayat. What do I mean? What do I mean by a panchayat? I mean not a government as much as a series of leaders and citizens who could approach their own leader. So that was true for the Rajputs, the Brahmins, the Baniyas, the lower castes. Okay, so everyone had their own panchayat, and everyone kind of reported and functioned within that. That panchayat, the group of leaders were responsible for solving local disputes, allocating resources to members of their own group. Subsequently, there was also a larger panchayat where the Rajput leaders kind of dominated. That was for the entire village. And while on paper there was a lot of deliberation, just like Henry Maine saw in the 1880s and Gandhi kind of idealized, what Retzlaff actually argues is that in practice, all the conversations would happen, and then in the end, whatever the Rajput wanted, that would happen. So, you could have all the debating amongst the caste groups in the larger panchayat, but in the end, the Rajput guys would kind of tell you what to do, and that's what would be the eventual decision. So there was consensus, but it was more like cheap talk, where you would kind of all talk, but in the end, the decision was already preordained. Okay. And yet, what is amazing is after the 1947, UP actually passed its own Panchayati Raj Act, and it said elections should be held for panchayats, and these elections should be done by a show of hands or by anonymous vote. And remarkably, what Retzlaff documents is that once this these elections were kind of mandated and were supposed to be held, the Rajputs began to see factionalism within themselves, in the sense that different powerful Rajputs in the village began fighting amongst themselves, which meant that if they wanted to win the elections, they needed support of other people outside their own Rajput caste. And so therefore, they would often approach the lower castes for support, which meant that they had to give something to the lower castes in return. So what Retzlaff is documenting is a very hierarchical village structure that is slowly being churned by the introduction of village elections. Okay, so that's the picture that he very broadly paints. It's a great book. I recommend this strongly for anybody interested in understanding village India better, village government especially. However, while this was the picture in the 50s, between the 50s and the early 90s, because there was no real upward mandating or upper level mandating of village governments didn't actually function very well. So in fact, the Ashok Mehta committee in 1978 was kind of tasked with changing or with taking stock of the role of village panchayats across India. And they basically say that not much is happening or has happened. There's been a dissociation of the growing and complex program of development with Panchayati Raj. These were considered inadequate. The bureaucrats refused to kind of give up their power in order to empower these local bodies. Nobody in the political class, the MLAs and the MPs, really wanted panchayats to get more power. And so therefore, there was no real clarity about what exactly these Panchayati Raj institutions should look like. And that strongly affected how these Panchayati Raj institutions function. Okay, so just to kind of recap very quickly, there were two main things you see in the Ashok Mehta report. One is that the bureaucrats, MLAs and MPs refused to give up their power. And two, constitutionally, there was no real formal structure for how these Panchayati Raj institutions should function. And so that therefore created a lot of lack of clarity and confusion. Both these problems, in some sense, were tackled in 1992, which has basically been a radical departure from everything that came behind. In 1992, the 73rd Amendment of the Panchayati Raj Act was, of the Indian Constitution was introduced, and in 1993, in April, it was passed. Essentially, this entire problem, this Nehruvian vision that states can figure out their Panchayati Raj, all of that was kind of casted away, and essentially the act argues that every village mandates that every village in the country should now have a democratically elected panchayat. The panchayat should have a headman, a village head, and these villages were are called gram panchayats under the act, and that's what we will call them going forward in this talk. The gram panchayats could have up to 33% reservation for women, and there was proportional reservation for Dalits and STs. So this was the concession made to the Ambedkarite view of the world, which said that, what is the point of having panchayats if there's no equality? Well, we'll constitutionally mandate that the leaders of these panchayats now will be from lower castes. That was the answer of the 73rd Amendment. They also mandated the creation of separate finance commissions at the national and the state level to send funds to these panchayats. So it was not just that you would just devolve some powers, you would actually devolve funds also to panchayats. And the decisions, and this goes back to the Henry Main Gandhi view of the world, the decisions in these panchayats would happen in a participatory manner. In particular, the executive would be the elected sarpanch and the panchayat office, the local bureaucrat, the panchayat development officer or the panchayat secretary. But the legislature would be all citizens of the village would come together in the Gram Sabha and would together formulate policies. Okay. So that was the radical departure. I want to kind of emphasize how radical this was, because in one signature of the pen, or in one fell swoop, suddenly you had up to 2 lakh new electoral constituencies at a very local level, such that citizens in these really tiny hamlets, villages, gram panchayats, wards could elect their own leaders. In some sense, it deepened democracy in a way that has not been recognized as, at least in the popular writings that I have seen. And in my view, it is in every way as big as any of the fundamental constitutional amendments that we have seen over the last 75 years. Okay. What has happened since is basically what we do. So here's where I kind of move into more technical analysis of, rooted more in economics. But basically, I'll discuss a few empirical papers that deal with the main concerns around Panchayati Raj that was voiced by people like Ambedkar and Nehru. I'll talk about how the introduction of the 72nd and 73rd Amendments affected elite capture. What was the role of reservations? Have reservations actually worked in this context? And finally, how has this decentralization and local democracy actually impacted lives of people on the ground? So I'll discuss 3-4 papers that kind of talk about all of these. So let me define elite capture for 1 second. Elite capture is basically what you saw in Ralph Retzlaff's village, where you had a bunch of Rajputs who captured the entire Panchayati Raj institution such that it worked exactly as they wanted it to work. That is what elite capture is, right? And so let's start with a paper in Maharashtra. This paper is set in kind of Maharashtra, across many villages there. The dominant castes there are the Marathas. And basically, the way these panchayats function is that when Marathas are kind of own a lot of land and have a very small proportion of the overall population, they completely can capture local institutions. What does that mean? Imagine that you have a village with 100 plots of land, and maybe there were 100 families, and 3 Maratha families own all the 100 plots of land. So they're just 3 families, they take over all the plots of land. And so they then have this kind of feudal relationships with all the other castes, in particular the low castes. Okay. What do the Marathas then do? Well, the Marathas firstly win elections. How do they win elections? There's this vicious cycle they basically create. So they become the sarpanch, and then they prevent the implementation of all these government welfare programs like free ration or Narega or village public goods like building schools for lower castes and stuff like that. And once they block it, what this means is it makes these low caste households extremely dependent on these on these elite Maratha families, right? So when these Maratha families make these low caste extremely dependent on them, they go and tell them, don't worry, you depend on us. We'll give you insurance. Whenever there's a drought, we will be there for you. Whenever you need, whenever there's a problem in your family, where you have, an illness or a marriage, we will give you, we will protect you from really negative consequences. But on the other hand, and we also have these amazing trading networks. We have other Maratha groups you're friends with in other villages. You can come to us and we can help you trade your goods and offer your services to them. However, you should vote for us. So the low caste households in this context kind of trade these two things off, right? They broadly get a sense that these Marathas may be blocking things on their behalf. On the other hand, the Marathas seem to be, at least on paper, doing a lot of good things for them. And so therefore, they continue to vote for these Maratha elites who have basically captured the entire panchayat. It's a beautiful paper. It's Sivan Anderson, the late great Ashok Kotwal were co-authors of this paper. And what is really nice is that this paper kind of tells you that despite there being panchayat elections, there is elite capture. It does tell you that, the richer households or the elite households kind of own the land and therefore have these kind of feudal relationships that ensure that they continue to win elections on their own. Okay. That's one paper, and I'd encourage you to read this in more detail. I can send it to Bikram. I can send a list to Bikram or Anisha, and you can kind of go through these papers. There's another paper that I want to kind of spend some time talking about. This is a paper that I am a co-author on, and it's a working paper. And what we do here in this paper, we kind of try and understand elite capture through who wins elections. So this graph on your screen is very hard to understand, so I'm going to explain this to you. But basically, what we do is for the state of Bihar, we take Gram Panchayat elections for the reserved and unreserved seats. I'll start with unreserved seats. And we look at all citizens in these panchayats and all elected representatives. So we have data on 9.7 crore citizens. And of these 9.7 crore citizens of rural Bihar, we match it by name to the 10 lakh local politicians who have been elected across panchayats in Bihar. Okay, so then we can ask who becomes a politician. And what we find is, if we just look at the unreserved seats, don't look at the reserved seats, just unreserved seats, it is the more elite, households, richer households, or higher castes that kind of push people into government. However, what is interesting and what we find, and what this graph is kind of trying to show you, is that yes, it is the more elite households that get elected to power, especially in unreserved seats. However, within that, the candidates are often people who are more educated than the average citizen. They are more educated than even their own siblings. So, you have this kind of more educated people contesting elections. They're more educated than their own fathers, of course, but they're also more educated than the average citizen, and they're more educated than the than their own siblings in their own household. So it tells you that there is some positive selection. Insofar as you think of education as some metric of competence, there is some positive selection even at the panchayat level on things like education. So what does this graph show you? This graph is basically telling you the mass of people with a certain level of education. So it's just plotting that mass. And that's the years of schooling. It's standardized. What you're basically seeing is that this point here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Anisha, can you see my cursor? I don't, you can, right? Okay, great. So this kind of mass here tells you that there are many more people, because that's the candidates who are contesting, who have higher levels of schooling than either candidate siblings or fathers. And in fact, citizens have a large mass here, right? And candidates have a much smaller mass there. And that's basically telling you that negative education or lower education is more likely in citizens and higher education is more likely in candidates. That's what the graph is plotting. We were able to do this because we were able to match data for all citizens and candidates. So it tells you that there is some elite capture, but there's also some positive selection. So that's result number one. But then when you look at all castes, so forget just unreserved seats, let's look at reserved and unreserved seats. What we find is that you find this kind of trade-off between representativeness and kind of competence. I'll explain that to you. If you just look at the comparison between fathers of candidates and citizens' fathers, what you see is that even the fathers of these candidates are kind of marginally more educated. This is the coefficient on their average education level compared to their peers than the fathers of all citizens, or basically men in their own age group. On the other hand, if you just look at candidates versus citizens, candidates are much better, much more educated than their fathers are compared to fathers' peers. So candidates are more educated compared to all citizens, and their fathers are not as much educated compared to all fathers. So in some sense, candidates are being positively selected, even with respect to their fathers. And of course, the positive selection is much higher for the unreserved candidates than reserved, but it exists for almost all categories of even reserved candidates. That's the cool result we find. And so therefore, what all of this is telling us is that panchayat elections are captured, yes, but reservations kind of help reduce some of that capture. And even when there is capture, the more competent leaders are being elected. So those are three results that we find from Bihar, and this is recent work. So I'm just going to quickly summarize the literature using Mansoori and Rao, who say, where do you find most elite capture? I mean, this is kind of obvious almost. Anybody who thinks about India will think that elite capture is more likely when there is more inequality in these villages, when villages are more remote, when there's low literacy, when there's poverty, and when there's a lot of caste gender disparities. Cast your mind back to the India that Ambedkar lived in. This is the India. Most villages had inequality. They were remote from centers of power. They had low literacy and all of this, right? So in some sense, Ambedkar was right that elite capture will exist, and especially in the India that he envisaged or he saw. Whereas the Gandhian vision was more utopian, and perhaps the post-90s era is a time when you could kind of start experimenting with the Gandhian vision, which is what we saw. Okay, so that's elite capture. Now let's move to reservations. I know I have about 8 minutes. So let me quickly tell you about reservation. Does reservation work? I'm going to talk about two papers. One is from West Bengal. This is Chattopadhyay and Duflo. They look at, some of you may already know this paper. Basically, they look at female reservation at the Sarpanch level, which is or Mukhya, as they call them in Bihar, the Sarpanch level, because of reservation. So what they kind of try to do is, if a panchayat has a woman Sarpanch, how does that affect what policies are being implemented? And what they do that's really cool is they basically try and go to citizens and they ask them, what do you want your government to spend on? So they ask this of both women and men. And so they are able to kind of identify that some policies women are like much more than men, and other policies men like much more than women. What they find is, because the allocation of the Sarpanch position is kind of randomized, in places where you have a woman leader, you are much more likely to see citizen preferences or policies being implemented that are more aligned with what women care about. So women leaders actually represent things that women care about, which is a very interesting result. It's an early result. What was really cool about this result in my head was that, a lot of these leaders and these positions in this time, in 2004, these were all women who were first-time leaders. So you had these first-time women leaders who had barely any experience, who were coming in to become heads of panchayats, and they're already able to influence policies in ways that actually benefit other women, right? So reservation is one way. If you think of elites in a village by gender, of course, the men are more elite than the women. So reservation, of course, already begins to reduce elite capture according to this paper. Okay. There's another paper I'll talk about very quickly, which is work that I am part of, which is with my co-author Chinmay Kumar. And we ask in Bihar if reservation works. Okay. It's a pretty complicated paper, so I'm going to kind of give you the big picture highlights of the paper. All these papers I would recommend you, especially if you're a development economics student, to study, to go over. So we measured the impact of reservation for SC positions. So we did women in the previous paper. Now we're doing Dalits in Bihar. And we have a lot of data. We have data from the census on all public goods built across all 45,000 villages in Bihar. We have the socioeconomic caste census. So we actually have data by household for the key assets the household owns, like phones, fridge, roof, car. And then we also have data on electoral results. So we have data on political participation of candidates, who contest elections, who wins, who doesn't. We use an econometric technique called a regression discontinuity design. So even though reservation is not randomized, we are still looking at very similar panchayats. One panchayat got reserved, the other did not. That's what you need to kind of keep in mind. So what do we find in this paper? Again, the graphs are, let me explain the graphs after I kind of walk you through the results. The main results are that we find no overall effects of reservation in the short run, and we can't really say much about the long run. But we do find reduced inequality between SCs and non-SCs. So if you think that, panchayat institutions were captured, non-SCs benefited much more than SCs, typically reservation actually lowers the gap between SCs and non-SCs in access to private assets. There are more schools and roads being built within the panchayat. There are certain areas where SCs live. That's where you see more schools, more roads, more anganwadis being built when there's reservation. You also see more political participation of SCs in panchayat elections. This is not only when there's reservation. This is even after reservation is removed. So you have reservation for 10 years in Bihar in a panchayat, and then the panchayat reservation cycle switches. So the panchayat is no longer reserved. Even then, SCs continue to participate in local elections and win at actually 5 times the rate of SCs in non-reserved panchayat that have never seen any reservations. So you're seeing the emergence of a new political scheduled caste leaders. These benefits are accruing. Even in the long run, SCs see a lot of catch up with non-SCs. And why is this happening? Well, we see that more public goods are being built in the short run and the long run. You're much more likely to get an SC Mukhya, an SC village head in the absence of reservations in places that were previously reserved. You see much more NREGA, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana housing. And that basically means that, there are more benefits being accrued to SCs. However, if you see who benefits, and these are all kind of short-run effects, in the short run, you see that, non-SCs and dominant non-SCs are doing slightly worse. SCs are doing slightly better. But it's not that dominant SCs are doing much better or anything like that. But basically, it's the top part of the SC asset distribution that's doing much better. So within SCs, the richer people benefit, or there's a kind of moving away of the top part of the asset wealth distribution, so suggesting that people who belong to the Mukhya's neighborhood or have their own surname are doing particularly well. But in the long run, everyone benefits. So in the long run, we see, for all SCs, the yellow thing here, I don't know if you can see it, but all SCs benefit in the long run. We can't break it down in the long run because we don't have big enough sample. But what this basically argues is that there is some quote unquote creamy layer stuff happening in the short run, but in the long run, everyone seems to benefit from reservation. Okay, so that's this paper. Then let me quickly do one paper on whether Gram Sabhas work. Okay, so does deliberation work? Does the Gandhian view of everybody coming together and talking about their problems actually change outcomes? Here, there's a paper by Das from 2014. Das basically looks at the REDS data. Again, if you're a developer economist, a very good data set. Between 2006 and 2008, first, what he finds is about 13% of villagers attend the Gram Sabha. So it's not that everyone's attending, but 13 is still not bad. I mean, my own experience, to be completely honest, is that less than 5% attend. So 13% is a big number for me. But what they find is there's a big difference in gender in who's attending. Men attend much more than women. But there's no big difference in castes. So all castes kind of are equally represented, except men are much more likely to attend. What does he ask? He says, well, if more women attend Gram Sabhas, does that actually change policies towards what women care about? And yes, he finds that happens. In places where women attend more, there's much more likelihood that policies about health and sanitation, which women care deeply about, actually improve, and things like roads, which women don't care as much about, actually reduce. So he sees that. So deliberation seems to work. This is some early work. I am more skeptical, to be completely honest. More later work in non-economics fields also suggests that a lot of the Gram Sabhas don't work as they should on paper. But there is no real good work on the effects of Gram Sabhas, and this is as good as it gets in economics. Okay. Does decentralization work? In the sense that now we're approaching the biggest part of the question. So you decentralize to panchayats. Does this actually work? Now, the problem is, in an ideal economics paper, you should be comparing areas that had decentralization versus areas that didn't. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of variation. So Narasimha and Weaver do something really cool. They go to UP And in UP, there's this very interesting rule where they say that if the village population crosses 1,000, the village becomes a GP by itself. It elects its own sarpanch, it has its own village government, everything. But if the village population is just less than 1,000, let's say it's 999, it is clubbed with some other village. So now you can compare villages that have population of 999 and 1,001. If a village has 1,001 people, it's a whole gram panchayat with 1,001 people. If a village is 999 people, there's another village maybe with 500 people who's kind of clubbed with it. So you have a gram panchayat of 1,400 people. So now you have outcomes in the same type of village, but one is part of a larger gram panchayat than others. And the question they ask is, do smaller gram panchayats actually improve outcomes? And that is their metric of decentralization. Remember, the ideal experiment is that, in some areas, you have the MLA look after governance, in the other areas, gram panchayats look after governance. We don't have that kind of an experiment anywhere in India. So instead, they look at villages that are part of a gram panchayat with 1,400 people versus villages that are part of a gram panchayat with 999 people or 1,000 people, right? So that's the comparison they're doing. What do they find? They find that smaller GPs are better. They find that you have better infrastructure, more roads, more schools, more PDS shops, better targeting of welfare programs, better NREGA outcomes. And, these effects are strongest when the GP itself is small. So when there's a GP with 1,000 or 1,000 or 2,000 people, that's basically where you see the strongest effect. It's a really nice paper. I would recommend you to read it. It's much more nuanced than I'm making this out to be. This is a stylized summary. But then the question is, of course, why does this happen? And this gets to the heart of the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate, in my opinion. They argue that this is because there's greater civic engagement in smaller GPs. When the GPs are really small, then citizens and the leaders know each other really well. Citizens actually participate more in elections. They show up for Gram Sabhas. The politicians who are elected are not kind of powerful people who have criminal records. And smaller GPs don't have more elite capture. So this fear that, if you have a really small GP, all these elites will just take over everything, that also they don't see. So it's a really cool paper with a really nice set of results, and I think great implications for decentralization. The final paper I'll kind of quickly touch upon is another paper that I'm part of, which basically asks, what does local democracy add? So I just said that, your ideal comparison is places that have village government versus places that don't. Well, here's one paper. During COVID in Karnataka, what happened was that 5,000 elections were postponed in about 5,800 GPs. Okay, so what that basically meant is that appointed administrators took over governance of those GPs. However, there were 200 GPs where the elected heads continued to govern because they were on a different electoral cycle. So they did not have elections upcoming. They were on their own electoral cycle. So now you can compare places that had an appointed bureaucrat looking after governance versus places that have an elected leader looking after governance. So it's a really cool comparison we can do. And we ask who does better, and what do our results show? We find that actually elected leaders represent citizen preferences better, but they respond more to elite citizen preferences. So there is some elite capture. So if you look at the graph on the right, what this says is that the blue line is the whose preferences are represented in government. So that's the men, and this is the women. And this is the additional effect that you get from elected leaders. So they represent men's preferences more than women. Men are anyway represented better at baseline, but even in elected places, men are better represented, but they're even more represented. That's true for men. That's true for, if you see, this is SC/ST, which is the lowest preference representation, and then you have OBCs, and then you have upper castes. So you have, again, this kind of hierarchy where the higher castes preferences are better represented overall and also better represented under elected leaders. However, the average effect is still positive of elected leaders. That's the takeaway, that it's not that elected leaders represent some people badly. They always represent people better. So that's the cool thing we find. And we also find that, elected leaders, this was during COVID, that's why elections were postponed. So a lot of people came back from the cities to the villages, and they demanded NREGA work because they needed some work. And in this point, elected leaders did a much better job implementing NREGA. There was a 15% increase in man days generated. And we don't find any large difference, however, in the overall GP performance, in the sense that the same number of roads, the same number of toilets were being built. It's just that in villages where some people cared about roads, or the average person cared more about roads, more roads were being built. Okay. And so However, we find that appointed administrators also have some specialized skills they bring to the table. I'll give you an example. Imagine that I was a drains inspector and now suddenly I'm thrown into the job of governing a panchayat. Then I am better at pushing drains projects than the average person. So appointed administrators have skill sets. They come with some skill set. Those skill sets they're able to do better. So our takeaway from the paper is that local democracy, of course, adds value. But ideally, we need both elected and appointed leaders working together. But we do need elected representatives. That's the takeaway that we have from that paper. So in some sense, to kind of quickly summarize, I'm about 4 minutes late. Both Ambedkar and Gandhi were broadly right. That's my takeaway in some sense. Village democracies suffer from some elite capture. However, the conditions for capture are slowly disappearing. The India of 2023 is not the India of 1947. Ambedkar was right that reservations matter, and the reservation actually improves outcomes for members of marginalized groups. And on deliberations and Gram Sabhas and the Gandhian ideal view of everyone coming together and talking, well, we're not quite there yet, but it's an idea that we should not give up on yet. That's the broad summary. The road ahead, I want to say maybe 1 minute on this. Devolution is still very patchy. Okay, it's not that panchayats have got all the funds, functions, and functionaries that they were supposed to get as per the 1992 Act. I mean, MPs, MLAs, DMs do not want to cede power. They don't want to give panchayats power, and it's obvious nobody wants to willingly cede power to a body that's lower than you. However, research and evidence suggest that we can do more, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. I want to end with a quote from a leader in Tamil Nadu who told me this really nicely. I asked him, why do you work for your people? What motivates you to work? And he said, if I leave home, there'll be 10 people waiting for me outside my door. And they're all people I know very well. I know intimately. And I have to answer to them because they're my people. Now, this is not the case for the MLA or the MP or the DM. The MLA, MPs, DMs will probably meet people, but they won't know who these people are. But for a local elected leader, the biggest strength that they have is they are from the people that they represent and they're closest to them. So that's, in my opinion, the strongest case for having local democracy. And of course, we will never reach the Gandhian ideal, and maybe that's not the right way to go. But I think our experiment with 2 million democracies is a partial success. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharan. I would like to now call upon Vikram Bourbon to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Sharan, and it was wonderful presentation and very elaborative presentation on Panchayati Raj. So I would like to request the participant, if you have any question, you can either raise your hand so that we can be asked, and you can mute yourself and raise your question, or you can put the question on the chat box. So we'll take the question from the chat box. So we can start with the one question. I think one clarification question is there on the chat box, Dr. Sharan.
Yeah. So the question says small GPs. So this goes back to the paper on decentralization, Narasimhan and Weaver. Yeah. So the smaller GPs are the ones that are non-combined. So they have their own village government. And Abhinav, that's exactly correct. So they have their own governments, and so therefore the outcomes there are better. That's what we find. That's what they find in the paper. And what a small aside on this paper, what is really nice is actually Narasimhan wrote a version of the paper by herself first, using the same data. Simultaneously, Weaver was working on it by himself, and they both found very similar results. And at some point, they kind of came together. But it's nice that you can look at the same data set, two separate researchers, find similar results, and then collaborate to write a joint paper. So, yeah.
So, yeah, if anyone can unmute and just ask the question if they have.
Okay, then I would go ahead because we usually give the opportunity for our participants, but I guess there are nobody coming forward. So my question was with respect to a paper I think you co-authored, wherein you were speaking about looking at the coefficients of the candidates and their parental education, right? The multicolored graph.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that, we are just looking at the education part. We're not looking at the elite capture when we're saying that, okay, the occupation of the father, the property that they own.
So the
Maybe you
reason,
can.
yeah, that's a great point. The big reason we can't look at, say, we can look at occupation, which we don't look at, but property, the reason we can't look at is the property of the father may be influenced by the success of the son. Imagine that you're a father, your son does really well, and then they can kind of buy property in the father's name. So father's property may not be a good metric for the conditions under which the son grew up. On the other hand, father's education is a great metric because the son cannot change the father's education. Even if the son does really well, it's not likely. The reason we only look at fathers and sons here is that we don't have, for women, we don't know what their original village is. So when they get married, they move to a new village, right? So, but we are matching within a village, we're matching fathers and sons. But for women, we can't do that because, you know, a woman's father will be in some other village and we don't know what that village is. But yeah, but for this, that's how we do it. And it's a common metric used in the development literature and also political economy to use father's education as a metric of background for exactly this reason.
Anyone else would like to go? So, in
Hello,
meantime,
yeah.
I have one. Yeah. Okay. You can go, Manish. Yeah.
Yeah. So, hello, Sharan. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I have a question. Like, I want to take your comments on how to understand whether women who have been elected have been a part as a dummy representative, and instead of them, their husbands or their sons are working. So, how to understand that bit?
I mean, this is a great question, and anybody who studies Panchayati Raj, this is one of the fundamental questions that they ask about, that we think about. Let me say two things. One is that it's an open question. I don't think we have a clear answer on how to measure what we call proxiness. I think short of actually talking to these women, spending time with them and their husbands, their literature hasn't really come up with an easily quantifiable metric of proxiness. And I think there's a lot of skepticism around this paper, by the way, the Chattopadhyay Duflo paper I quoted. There's actually a lot of skepticism. If you talk to Indian scholars who kind of worked on panchayats, not necessarily from a causal econometric economist perspective, they think that some of these results don't hold up to deeper scrutiny, that, you know, women representing women's preferences, how can that even happen if most women are just proxies for their husbands, right? The counter to that is what Chattopadhyay and Duflo argue is that, well, that may be true in the vast majority of cases, but there'll be a small minority of women who are able to kind of still represent preferences, and that is driving the average effects of female reservation. But I'll say two other things about proxiness. One is that proxiness has reduced over time. Yes, especially in these times in 2004, 2003, I think there was very high level of proxiness. It still exists, but it's reduced. And secondly, I think going forward, it is an important research agenda for people who study Panchayati Raj institutions, because first we need to develop a good metric of proxiness, then we need to understand the causal factors influencing proxiness. What are the types of castes that have more proxiness? What are the types of family backgrounds that give rise to more proxiness? I'll give you an example. I used to, as a naive young RA in the early 2010s in Andhra, I had the belief that it's basically all these lower caste women who may be proxy. I mean, that was my caste and class prejudice and privilege speaking. But I actually when I did fieldwork in villages, I actually realized that women leaders are actually much more open, outspoken, and outgoing amongst the lower caste than they are amongst the very high caste, because the caste norms in the higher castes are much more rigid. And so the gender norms, not the caste norms, but the gender norms. So actually upper caste women in villages often are prevented from leaving homes. It's only the very high upper caste that we see in the cities and everything, and we impute that to be the case everywhere. But there's a vast majority of powerful castes that don't let their women go out. And so I think this is an important research agenda for anyone thinking about these questions. So the question.
Anyone else would like to go? If you have a network issue, you can also post the question on the chat box. So yeah, I have one like question. One is that when you talk about the decentralization and panchayat, that's one of the issues that there's a devolution of power. But one of the thing that struggles the panchayat system is a struggle is the resources. When it how the financial devolution is happening, or the resources. How do you see in context of Bihar, where there's already a lot of issues with the resource distribution? So how that is helping in strengthening the panchayat system?
It's a great, I mean, again, excellent question. I think if you think of the ideal devolution finance model, it's the Kerala model. Kerala had in the early 2000s had a really good model where they kind of encouraged 40% of funds to go to panchayats, and then they had this Gram Sabha participatory decision making. They had committees for various government programs that were established from amongst the people. It was an excellent model, but most states don't devolve as much funds. And so the question then is, why, should you depend on funds from above, or should you be able to generate your own funds? So the typical Panchayati Raj model assumes that some of the funds, a good share of the funds, should come from the panchayats themselves, right? Local taxes, what in Karnataka you call the roof tax, should be put on households, and that fund should be used, therefore, to further village development programs. That, unfortunately, hasn't really taken off in a big way. We're doing some work now in Karnataka on local taxation and the determinants of local taxation, but it is, I think, central to how we think about making villages self-sufficient. If we have to move closer to the Gandhian ideal, one of the big ways villages are self-sufficient is they don't need funds from above, and they can generate their own funds. And for that, villages need to actually be able to. So it's a vicious cycle. If villages had the power to implement the policies they wanted, then they could get more buy-in from the citizens, and they could tax the citizens better. But since villages don't have that kind of power, and they're often still implementing programs and projects developed by someone sitting in the state capital or the national capital, they're unable to kind of claim complete ownership on the programs that they're implementing, which means that citizens also don't know whom to attribute the projects to, and so they're less willing to give all the money or pay taxes. It's a chicken and egg problem. Taxes are much worse in places like Bihar, by the way, than Karnataka, and Kerala is doing really well as expected. But yeah.
Any more question?
Okay, so
yeah,
I can go with one more, and this is about the size of the Gram Panchayat, as you have mentioned in your presentation, that the sizes of Gram Panchayat really affects the outcomes, the development outcomes. What do you think are the reasons governments still they are not making the small Gram Panchayats and still thinking of it's a bigger Gram Panchayats are running?
I think twofold, Munish. I think one is that people don't want to cede power to smaller administrative units. That's one big reason, I think. I don't know how UP kind of went with this 1,000 person GP village rule. Strikes me as amazing. I mean, you work in Bihar, so you know that Bihar has 8,000 panchayats for 12 crore rural population. UP has 20 crore rural population and 60,000 panchayats. It's like has not even twice the number of GPs. Not twice the number of population, but 6 times the number or 7 times the number of GPs. So, I found a quote by Gandhi when I was doing research for this, where he said, I imagine a village to be one of 1,000 souls. So I think in his head, he had a conceptualization of a village with 1,000 people in it. I don't know if that influenced in some way this rule. But basically, people don't like to devolve. I mean, anybody who's powerful doesn't want to cede any bit of that power. The second problem, which a lot of these powerful people will tell you, is that, okay, we devolve, but then we'll have to find new panchayat secretaries, anganwadis, like you have to find a whole bunch of functionaries at this level, and you have to find ways to pay them. Right now, you can pay one Panchayat secretary for 12,000 people, and then you can save some money. But if you make, every Panchayat 1,000 people, then you have to find 12,000 Panchayat secretaries, which is kind of crazy. So crazy in the sense that this is what they tell you. Let me say one last thing here is that since you work a little bit on stuff like this, I've always believed that, from our work also that, the wards versus Mukhya in Bihar, ward is basically 1,000 people roughly. Mukhya, and each Panchayat has about 12 wards and one Mukhya, and more power should be devolved to wards for precisely some of these reasons, that the ward leader is very local. And like the UP work shows us, the ward leader knows everybody. There are 200 households in the ward. They know every single one, and every single one knows them. And these households have seen each other for the longest time. So that creates situations where they are much more accountable to the final person on the ground. The last mile delivery, therefore, should improve. And we saw that in Bihar with the implementation of Nal Jal and Ali Gali projects in the 2016 to 2020 phase, where wards were given responsibility to implement this. And I think that takes care of a lot of these elite capture concerns that you have at the GP level. And wards don't have that much elite capture. This is basically what even Narasimhan and Weaver find, right? So smaller constituencies do not have more elite capture. And so that's something to think about more deeply.
Thank you.
Is there any question? I think there is no. So I would like to have a last question. So one of the questions we see is that the problem of the bureaucratic convergence or alliance. So even in the Panchayat level, whether it's Narega, whether it's other kind of resources, they need to hugely rely on block officers and others. And there has been always contestation between them. And in case of mostly the leakage in Narega and all. So the benefit primarily, like even in the leakage, the block officers are the main who takes the benefits. So how, from your research, how do you see this? You have seen this convergence or in the bureaucratic convergence, both in the solving the leakage and also that how they're misutilizing this kind of resources like through Narega or other kind of system using Panchayats?
Again, great question. I think that we don't. I mean, in terms of leakage, I think one of the main reasons there's leakage, other than block officers making money for themselves, is that a lot of this also goes into party funds. And block and district level bureaucrats are often kind of collecting resources for party functionaries and higher ups there. And that's something we often forget. Now, with Panchayats, if you take the case of West Bengal, which has party involvement directly in Panchayat elections, I think even the Panchayat elected officials are much more responsive to that pull, the pull of the party for money. Whereas in places like Bihar or other states or Karnataka, parties don't have a formal role in Panchayat functioning. So what that basically means is that you have at least some leaders who have no responsibility owed to any party. So if the block development officer comes and says, I want X amount of rupees or I will not do it, and you are from my party and or the people above are asking me, I can say I'm an independent leader. I've never been elected from any party. There is no party supporting me. So I owe you nothing. Now, I'm not saying that's how it works. That's an idealized conception. But the probability that you have leaders saying things like this improves a bit. That's how I would see it. In terms of corruption more broadly, yes, there is corruption in Narega. Yes, there is corruption in all rural development schemes. But I think that I don't see why that corruption is less or more important than corruptions in urban schemes, corruptions in allocation of licenses for production of, say, things like coal at the national level with these big capitalists. There's corruption everywhere. And the question I think then that comes into place is that does the corruption actually seriously hamper the functioning of the panchayat, or does it just act as a way to move things along? And as long as it is the latter, I'm okay with some amount of corruption. I think that's the kind of thought that someone like Gandhi would abhor, but it's a very pragmatic way of thinking about it, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. So I think we'd like to conclude the session now, and we have exceeded by 8 minutes. And thank you so much, Dr. Sharan, for giving all your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So first of all, let me just give formal vote of thanks. And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Sharan for considering our request and accepting our invitation, and also considering the request for postponing the event which was scheduled to happen in last month. So thank you so much for accommodating us. And I would also like to thank all the participants for joining us today and actively participating in this talk. And I would also like to thank YSI for giving us this platform to bring all the young scholars as well as the researchers to share their knowledge and discuss the pertinent issues regarding South Asia. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, if Dr. Sharan, you can share the resources with me or Anisha,
Sure.
and we can
Sure.
surely forward. Anyone, you can just send a mail to me or Anisha. I'll just put my mail ID here so that you can I can share the resources once Dr. Sharan share with me. So it was very nice to have you, Dr. Sharan.
Thank you so much. You can just call me Sharan, don't call me Dr. Sharan. I should have said this at the beginning. But yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, and it was really nice to give this talk. Thank you. Thanks, Anisha and Vikram and everyone.
Okay. Thank you. See you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, Dr. Sharan. We'll be in touch. Yeah.
Yes. Bye.
So I will end the